temps imparti à chaque intervention est de 10 à 15 minutes, compte tenu des interventions. Sans trop tarder, je vais donner la parole à Monsieur Mathieu Levitte, directeur programme Reynard sur le contre-terrorisme et le renseignement de Washington Institute for Near East Policy, United States. À vous la parole, monsieur.
Shukran. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. I'd like to take my time to share two different types of thoughts with you. One of them is kind of a big idea, structural thought. And the second is more focused on changes in the way American counterterrorism authorities are thinking about how to approach counterterrorism in general and what that might mean for Africa in particular. My first concern is that we're facing what I would describe as a perfect storm. The perfect storm comes from two things. One is radical technological change, and the second is the global pandemic. The radical technological change has created a phenomenon in which all ideas are equally accessible. There's no barriers to entry. There's no threshold for publication. You don't have to get past an editor. You don't have to be accepted into a publication. Anybody can put their ideas online, in a document, in a video, in a meme, and they're accessible. It gives voices to all kinds of people, and in a sense, that's good. It creates a greater kind of battle of ideas, competing ideas, but it also gives voice to conspiracy theories. It gives platform to disinformation campaigns, and it creates space where violent extremist and terrorist ideologies can flourish. That's something we've been dealing with for a while. But when you now plug that in to what we are facing globally as the human race in the COVID-19 global pandemic, I think we have a whole new type of a concern. The pandemic undermines trust in institutions. It undermines trust in systems such as the rule of law. It undermines trust in ideas and the purveyors of those ideas. That could be ideas such as science. It can be the purveyors of those ideas like traditional media. It leads people to question who should they believe in and who should they trust. And that is very dangerous, coming against the reality of tremendous economic hardship that is the result of the closures, the lack of travel, the constriction of the international economy. Those economic hardships come on top of the obvious public health crisis, seeing your loved ones sick, seeing people die, and more so the unequal suffering that people experience under COVID. Some places have more access to vaccines. Some people have more money and are able to navigate the crisis more easily. The social dislocation, the lack of human contact, not only pushes people online, but creates a crisis, which if I had to sum it up in one word that best describes the crisis we face encountering and preventing violent extremism, that word is uncertainty. The human being needs some sense of what's coming next. How long will this last? How will I get out of it? And if you cannot give a human being some type of certainty, that creates tremendous anxiety, tremendous stress. Traditionally, plagues lead to apocalyptic thinking. It makes people really stressed. Who should I blame? And we blame the other, whether that is someone who is not as religious as you are, or doesn't have the same color skin as you do, or doesn't come from the same part of the world as you do. And finally, we have a situation where extremist ideas, because of all of these issues, are moving from the fringe to the mainstream. And so it's much more difficult to determine when and where to intervene when people start going down a path to radicalization. At what point are they now mobilizing to violence? That's much harder to detect, and it happens much, much faster. And it breeds extremism across all political spectrums, all ideologies and isms, from the far left to the far right, jihadist milieu, and every other you can imagine. That presents a whole library of problems that we are only now beginning to contend with. Colin Clark described some of it in terms of how we're dealing with the far right, in particular here in the United States. I would suggest that it's going to lead to an element of disagreement between the United States and some of its allies on where we should put our efforts. As the United States puts more attention to the far right, our allies in Europe and North Africa, for example, have a greater threat still from radical jihadist violence. And that might not be a complete confluence. And that takes me to my second point, which is that we really do need to find ways to convince governments to focus more on those things that are less tangible, but can have the greatest effect. We are very good at countering actual terrorists, at going to war with terrorists, at using law enforcement and intelligence and militaries. We are not very good, any of us, at using our clinical social workers, at using our societies to deal with radicalization at its earliest inset. The US government last year produced a strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability under a requirement by Congress called the Global Fragility Act of 2019. And it concluded that military should only be one part of the solution, and that the US should aim to address challenges posed by conflict and fragility around the world. That makes all the sense in the world, but it's very difficult to drum up support and money to support efforts that are preventative in focus, that are focused on crisis management. Such efforts are especially important to break the cycle of fragility, and they should be prioritized in those areas where today's strategic investment can mitigate tomorrow's overwhelming crisis. But it's very hard to focus policymakers on looking over the horizon and investing money on things that are not yet a real threat, even though strategic investment today in prevention could save us billions of dollars and achieve much better outcomes over the long run. We need to recognize that US efforts to rationalize counterterrorism are very much in effect. We need to make our counterterrorism efforts more financially sustainable. The United States feels a need to free up resources for other national security threats, such as those focused on great power competition. How can the United States move from a situation where for the past 20 years, much of the counterterrorism effort around the world has been US-led and partner-enabled? And what most Americans now across the political spectrum want to do is move to flip that, to make it partner-led and US-enabled. The US would lead when there are threats to our homeland, to Americans abroad, but any other threat, Africa or elsewhere, that is not an immediate threat to the United States would support it, but someone else would take lead, perhaps like the French initiative in the Sahel. So moving to that direction, I think it's important to realize that whether or not Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, or other terrorist groups in Africa pose an immediate threat to the US homeland today, we must recognize that Africa has become a very fast-growing terrorist hotbed, with violent extremist incidents in the Sahel doubling every year since 2015. And so I argue that it would not be wise to wait until that threat grows and suddenly does present a significant threat to US interests. Convincing people to make that investment in places like Africa today is going to be difficult, though. They're going to have to be partner-led and US-enabled. And they should focus not primarily on support for capacity building to the military, but civilian counterterrorism capacity building, to counterterrorism prosecutors, to efforts to combat illicit finance, and of course to countering and preventing violent extremism. In the United States, there's already been a move to move forces out of AFRICOM, Africa Command. Even though this is a small and affordable and effective deployment, in a letter, our former Secretary of Defense, Secretary Esper, raised concerns. In a letter to, Secretary Esper, U.S. lawmakers raised concerns about a possible reduction in U.S. forces to Africa. This bipartisan group noted that China and Russia are being aggressive in the region. And this is a region which is a significant counterterrorism risk. When you put these together, there's actually a significant amount of overlap between our counterterrorism goals and our great power competition goals. And that ultimately is what smart US counterterrorism policy is going to have to look like. Finding places where we can use overlap in those budgets to affect positive change in more than one area. At the end of the day, we're going to be dealing with the fallout from the global pandemic. And we're going to be dealing with the reality that these ideas can spread across borders and oceans like never before because of the technology revolution. We'll be dealing with those two things together for the next few decades, which makes it all the more critical today to try and get ahead of the problem. Convincing policymakers, whether it's here in the United States or in Morocco or anywhere in between, to invest not only in the threats that we can see today, but to invest to prevent things from not being threats tomorrow is always a very, very difficult challenge. I'm very grateful for the time you've given me to speak. I'm honored to be able to participate in this conference. I thank you all very much.
Parce que vous avez respecté le temps imparti. Je relevais dans votre intervention le mot incertitude qui vient suite à deux phénomènes qui sont complètement dévastateurs. Le premier, c'est l'effet négatif de la digitalisation et le deuxième, c'est l'effet de la pandémie actuelle, ce qui accentue davantage les risques et vous incitez les gouvernements à investir dans la prévention pour parer à ce genre de danger. Merci monsieur et sans tarder, je vais donner la parole à monsieur Roberto Mogavero, président de l'Observatoire sur la sécurité et la défense Italie. Je vous remercie. À vous la parole, monsieur.
So can you hear me now? Great. Thank you so much for the invitation to this very important and interesting workshop. I have a presentation, so I would like to share with you my screen. Can you allow me to share the screen? Okay, great. Thank you so much. Can you see it? Yes? Can you confirm me?
Yes, we see.
Oh, yeah, great. Thank you so much. Yes. Okay, I start my presentation. So I will be brief, or I will try to be brief. I would like to share with you a point of view from the European perspective, about radicalization and the new threats of terrorism. Yes, as you know, and we all know that the current terrorist threat is composed by a lot of different elements and single weapons. Illegal immigration, lack of integration, social exclusion in peripheries, especially for big cities and in Europe, extremist ideology, and also the presence and transit in and out of Europe of returning or fighters reaching the crisis area. About the current situation from our point of view, from the European point of view, it's clear for us that the international terrorist groups, in particular Daesh and Al-Qaeda, have lost key sectors and territory, and the result has been a geographical retreat. But on the other side, they continue to resist, to reorganize, and in some way to redistribute the territory, let's say, their territory. And another important point for us is that the decrease, the result of geographical retreat is not resulting also in a decrease of effectiveness. In fact, the terrorist group's battlefield retreat correspond in another way to an increase of asymmetric, unconventional extremist activism locally for the different countries and abroad. You know well that in a lot of regions, Middle East, North Africa, Balkans, the international terrorism here took advantage of weaknesses of local government institution in order to exploit this content and so to reinforce their presence. And also the isolation of some communities has contributed to that phenomenon. And in relation to the radicalization in Europe, the situation, of course, varies country to country, but the trigger and the home of radicalization for almost all countries across Europe are places where the isolation and degradation take place, especially in peripheries of big cities, as I already told you. These places could become or are a bridgehead for the development, the creation of supporting network for returnees, or also for the creation of local terrorist cells, or for the growth of lone wolves or attackers conducting hostile action against EU countries. In this, for us, it's clear that radicalization can take root, especially in dark corners of the so-called prosperous, modern, and democratic Europe, but where we have a lot of corners, dark corners, where unemployment, corruption, racism, social exclusion, and human rights violation are prevalent. And another point is that recent studies indicate for us that especially Daesh, but also other terrorist groups, are recruiting young people not at all categorized as marginalized people, but most of the time joining criminal gangs, so joining local crimes, but also organized crime. Terrorist groups leveraging their dominance in those areas adapted communication strategies, but also in some extent also the operational tactics in a bid to exploit two main elements to measure topical issues that act also as accelerant for the actual problems and threats. And those topics and topical issues are the European social fears and reaction engendered by the inflow of migrants into Europe, and also the pervasive anonymity made possible by the cyber environment, the cyberspace. continuing to the threat trend, for us it's clear that to pursue the strategy of indirect threats, international terrorist groups in Europe relies on a support base from persons and elements with different experiences and coming from different backgrounds. Within this supporting base, only a minority of people are sufficiently radicalized to undertake action or attacks in the name of Daesh or Al-Qaeda. But this minority, therefore, constitute a very important asset for the terrorist organization, and they want to manage and protect such assets and such people. Of course, a system and a network like this not only maximize the capability of terrorism or a terrorist group to inflict harm, but also represent the consolidated capability of organization to operate concretely at multiple levels using different ways, different elements, lone attackers, support network, returnees, and this in order to also refocus their efforts when necessary and when and where there is most likely to prove effective in a given contingency. In relation to prevention of radicalization in Europe, it's very important to consider the legislation and law related to anti-terrorism. In 2002, the EU Council Framework Decision on Combating Terrorism laid out the first agreed definition, common definition of terrorism and terrorist organization. Before that, only UK, Germany, Italy, France, and Spain had legislation on terrorism and terrorist organization in order to meet special national needs and to respond to the local challenges posed by radicalization. In 2005, the European Union's counter-terrorism strategy, analyzing more in-depth issues related to terrorism and radicalization, approved that strategy, and the document identifies 4 main measures of prevention: combating radicalization and recruitment of terrorists, protection, hunt for terrorists, but in particular, trying to cut the sources of financing, and development of response mechanisms to deal with possible or potential attacks. In April 2007, procedures related to the European arrest warrant were in some way fine-tuned and also were clarified, adding another important element to the European counter-terrorism strategy. In that period, 2 important attacks happened in 2 European capital cities, in Paris and in Berlin, triggered a big debate, a great debate, and brought the weaknesses of Europe to the forefront, and this called into question the principle related to the free movement of people within the Schengen area. This debate highlighted also critical failings and shortcomings, not only related to information sharing and the unity of political purpose within the European Union, but also highlighted the effectiveness of relations and agreements between EU and countries from the south of Mediterranean, and also with the possible areas of crisis, such as the Balkans, the Balkan region. And despite the clear evidence, the awareness of the global terrorist threat and the continuing flow of foreign fighters in and out the European region, EU member states are having still difficulty in keeping track of citizens having migrated to Daesh or Al-Qaeda control areas, in general terrorist control areas. And the EU member states are also finding difficulties in order to identify groups with links in crisis area, and in particular with the Balkans, where a lot of elements and organizations are promoting ideologies, inciting people to enlist in the ranks of terrorist groups or acting as lone perpetrators in Europe. A crucial instrument in tracking the possible menaces and potential terrorists is the EU passenger name record system approved in 2016. And in addition, in parallel, Europol, Eurojust, Frontex, and CEPOL started opening special channels on counterterrorism with a lot of countries in hope trying to make up for the lack of intelligence activities and information sharing. It is evident, increasingly evident, that greater cooperation is needed at European level, but also and especially between EU and the neighbors who lack terrorism legislation and or whose institutions are mainly concerned with preserving the domestic balance in internal security rather than acting in concern with foreign or international bodies. In this, the European Counterterrorism Center, the ACDC, set up by Europol in January 2016, marks a step in the right direction, with the main objective to pool intelligence about foreign fighters and terrorist financing, and in particular also promoting international cooperation among institutions dedicated to combat terrorism. Another important element is the national and international legislators and security forces and institutions that are forced to move very quickly in revising their definition of terrorism and terrorist organization. This in order to help implementing effective strategies of prevention against attacks. And in this, just a couple of words about the RAN network. In 2011, the European Commission launched the Radicalization Awareness Network, bringing together European professionals dealing with the phenomenon on a daily basis. So bringing together doctors, teachers, social workers, police officers to map out a common route forward. Working group set up in connection with RAN, analyze past and future action with the primary purpose in order to create training programs, publication works, seminars. Of course, RAN doesn't replace the local prevention programs, but complement that national programs. The amount of effort of European activity in this, in preventing radicalization, is evidenced by the latest report published by RAN, which lists and assesses the principal projects, practices, approaches, all of which attest the far-reaching, let's say, commitment both of government institutions and NGOs in dealing with that threat. I think the time is gone, 15 minutes, so I stop my presentation, but I'm available for any question or any clarification. So thank you so much for your time, and I stop sharing. Okay, I'm here. And,
Merci beaucoup pour votre intervention. Il a été question de la manière avec l'Europe essaie un petit peu de prévenir la radicalisation avec principalement une batterie de normes et par la suite des politiques de prévention, que ce soit au niveau de l'Europe ou dans les prolongements de cette dernière. Merci beaucoup pour votre intervention et surtout pour votre respect du temps imparti. Et je donnerai par la suite la parole à Monsieur Erzébet Rosa et Victor Marseille, et qu'il me pardonne si jamais j'ai écorché son nom. Il est Senior Research Fellow à l'Institute of World Economics en Hongrie et chef de Africa in the Globalized World au groupe de recherche Ludovica à l'Université nationale de l'administration publique de Hongrie. À vous la parole. Merci beaucoup.
شكرا لكم يا سيد رئيس الجلسة وأيها زملاء أيها مشاركين المحترم. أولا نريد أن نشكركم لهذه الإمكانية العظيمة حتى نستطيع أن نقدم لكم نتائج البحوث نحن نعمل عليه هنا في المجر بعيدا من الساحل ومن المغرب. And permit me to go on with our presentation in English. I shall be very brief of the details. I would just like to raise 2 points, 2 main points from our research. We have found that in the past few years, there has been an increasing number of attacks against forward operating military bases in the Sub-Saharan Africa. And just referring back to former speakers, Dr. Lewitt, Dr. Mugavero, but also in the morning to Professor Alainawi, I would like to raise 2 issues. One is the territorial dimension. I myself have been working more on the Daesh, and the international literature most often raised the issue of the importance of territory, how Daesh has gained control over territory at a time when, in fact, in Africa, in the Sub-Saharan Africa, the different cross-boundary or trans-boundary terrorist organizations did already gain control over huge lands of huge pieces of territory. So territoriality has come to have a new role in the life and a new dimension in the life of different terrorist organizations. This is one thing. The other thing with regard to territory is that between 2011 and 2014 in the Sub-Saharan Africa, these groups were pushed backwards. They lost control of huge pieces of territory, which then made them to go for new kinds of warfare, new kinds of methodology, how to fight a terrorist, how to fight a war. This is one point. My colleague will explain that much better or in detail on a case over Somalia. But what I would like to raise still is another issue. Who are these actors? The other big question that has hit international relations in the past few decades, especially after the end of the Cold War, is that non-state actors are increasingly present and they are increasingly forming and shaping international relations and the security structures among actors. These terrorist organizations are not state, but still what is very interesting that they do have and they do practice limited state functions. If we just look at the Treaty of Montevideo, which has 4 conditions for a state territory. I have already spoken about that. Population, which goes with the territory. The third one is the governing capability, government, ministry structures. Dr. Ainavi referred in the morning to the functional state, to the protection of citizens, but this governing capability can cover anything from healthcare to education, from taxation to anything else. But the fourth capability, the fourth characteristic of a state is missing, namely the ability to maintain international relations with other international actors, mostly the states. So these are some points over which we are doing some research. And now I would pass the floor to my colleague, Victor Marshai, who would bring you more concrete examples. Thank you again.
Thank you, Professor Rosa. Welcome, everybody. Ahlan Fasaklan. So now I will continue with concrete examples, how different jihadist organizations implemented this new modus operandi in the Sub-Saharan theater, and how these new techniques endanger the stability, even in fragile spaces. The first area where jihadist groups started to use these tactics was in Somalia. It's very important to understand that actually the utilization and the use of this new modus operandi was actually paradoxically the consequence of military setbacks for Al-Shabaab in 2011, 2012. It lost many areas, internal disputes also jeopardized the organization, and it lost huge areas thanks to the African Union mission in Somalia. But in 2013-14, it became evident that African Union peacekeepers face also significant challenges in the country. To sum up, actually the mission was overstretched, and to stabilize its presence in the countryside, AMISOM started to erect forward operating bases in the countryside. And contrary to previous fortified position with more than 400, 500, 600 soldiers with huge enforced battalions, it consisted only some dozen or maximum some hundreds of troops. Thanks. Next slide. And furthermore, the operation area and the circumstances in environment, Somalia was not so easy. Actually, AMISOM was distributed into different sectors, but because of the lack of cooperation, proper cooperation between these sectors, many FOB was established in other sectors than in which the troop contributed countries used. For example, we see that in the case of Lego base, you can see in the map in the sector, in the third sector, actually the Burundian contingent took place in the Ethiopian sector. So it meant that they can't wait any support from the local AMISOM troops because there was no proper cooperation between the Ethiopian and the Burundian contingent. Thank you. Next slide. So as I mentioned, it was vulnerable contingent. The first attack happened in 2012 in Hosingo, but the Kenyan contingent at that time got proper intelligence reports, so they prepared for the attack, and they managed to hold the line. But 3 years later, in June 2015, Burundian troops were overrun in Lego. It was the first big military disaster for AMISOM in these years, but the first time everybody everybody spoke about that, oh, it was just Burundian contingent, they were not so prepared, they are not the best troops of AMISOM, so things happen. But just 3 months later, Ugandan troops were also overrun in Janale, and Ugandan troops was considered that perhaps the best trained and equipped part of AMISOM. The next contingent was the Kenyans in January 2016. It was perhaps the biggest military disaster in the whole history of AMISOM. According to different estimation, at least 150 Kenyan soldiers were massacred. And altogether, and 1 year later, the attacks happened again, against the Kenyan troops. And altogether in these 2 years, more than 20 FOB were overrun by Al-Shabaab, not only AMISOM FOBs, but also the FOBs of the Somali National Army. Thank you. Next slide. What was the characteristics of these battles and these FOBs? Actually, AMISOM lacked proper intelligence. Regularly, there were fresh troops in the bases, and they didn't have still connection with the local clans. And in many cases, troops were sleeping during the attack. So actually, they were not prepared for any military action. I mentioned the lack of cooperation between the FOBs and the bigger sector commanders because the different nationality in many cases. It's a constant problem for AMISOM, but also for other armies in the Sub-Saharan Africa that they are lacking air support. It's crucial for a quick reaction for similar attacks. And actually, the defense positions were also weak. There were not enough trench, bush was not cut around the bases, etc., etc. Contrary to AMISOM, Al-Shabaab prepared well for the attack. Hundreds of fighters participated in the mass infantry attacks. They cut communication lines, exploded mobile towers, bridges before the attack. So they sent the reinforcements to arrive to the scene. They established well-functioning cooperation with local clans, and they often utilized old grievances. For example, in the case of Elade, in the case of Kenyan contingent, they utilized the Marahan versus Ogaden clan century-old debate between the different actors. Yes, thank you. Next slide. What was the consequences? Altogether, killings of hundreds of AMISOM troops. AMISOM and SNA had to vacate dozens of FOBs. So it was a big strategic communication win for Al-Shabaab, which made videos for the attack, and the loss of credibility for the federal government of Somalia and AMISOM. And last but not least, Al-Shabaab managed to seize a huge amount of weaponry and equipment. Just the data that 60% of IDs used by Al-Shabaab in the next year came from the sources of the military bases, which was overrun. There was only one example when AMISOM was prepared for the attack. It was in Halgan, which was defended by Ethiopian troops. They managed to establish proper intelligence network and cooperation with local clans, and they also got air support in the form of combat helicopters. So before the attack, the Ethiopian troops established the killing zone, and altogether they killed more than 250 jihadists in the battlefield. But, and this is the big danger and threat in this form of mass infantry attacks against these FOBs, that even among these circumstances, these best circumstances, Ethiopia lost at least 40 soldiers in the battle. Thank you. Next slide. Know-how transfer is very strong in between African jihadists. So within, we can say, months, Boko Haram and its different factions also utilize these modus operandi in Lake Chad Basin, mainly ISWAP, actually in the same, among the same circumstances. Thank you. Next slide. You can see, okay, we can go to the next slide. And in some cases, even they were more successful than Al-Shabaab. In one occasion, even they managed to overrun a battalion-size garrison in the city of Jili. Actually, they used the brand new uniform of the Nigerian army, so they can very easily go near to the gate of the base, and after hundreds of Boko Haram fighters from the bush overrun the position, and they killed nobody knows exactly, but hundreds of Nigerian soldiers. Because time is running, we can go to the next slide, I think, and we can see the same in Mali and Burkina Faso. Also, the use of suicide vehicle-borne IDs, mass infantry attacks, and a very strong cooperation between the different jihadist groups. We know exactly that in the Sahel, there are more fragmented organizations, but what we can observe that they cooperate between themselves and with the local ethnic militias, and they also utilize the aforementioned old grievances, mainly ethnic, economic, and political debates between the different troops, and that hundreds of Malian soldiers were killed just in the last 1 year in these attacks. And if we are checking the news, almost every second month we see an overrun garrison in the middle part of Mali. Thank you. Next slide. And just some words about prospect, because our time is out. What is now that jihadists started to use a much wider toolbox in the Sub-Saharan Africa region, a combination of a conventional and a more asymmetrical warfare. They want to demonstrate their capability as a quasi-state actor in the form of a conventional war, and they're very successful in this overrunning of FOBs. There is no end in sight. We can observe increasing skills and the number of attacks. They're using new tactics. And just some days ago, near Borno State, Boko Haram used the same methods, and they used even armored personal carriers during the attack. So actually, what we see now, it's a it's a conventional war. So they are more adaptive, seems more adaptive than their enemies. And they also localize local support among tribes, clans, warlords, etc., etc. And what is a threatening trend, and what we should keep in our mind in connection with foreign peacekeeping missions in the region, but in the wider context of Africa, that the example of Halgan in Somalia, which was well defended by the Ethiopian troops, it demonstrates that even with the best circumstances, this kind of mass infantry attacks causes huge casualties even for the best trained defenders, because if 500-600 or more troops running towards a base supported by mortars and suicide vehicle-borne IDs, it's almost impossible to stop it without high casualties. So, and it's very important to say that it's not only a tactical, but because of its psychological and media effects, also strategic weapons in the hand of jihadists. So thank you very much. Shukran jazilan.
Merci pour votre intervention. Je voudrais saluer la présentation de Madame Rosa en arabe, et je voudrais aussi mettre en exergue le modus operandi des troupes djihadistes en Afrique, ainsi que les connexions qui se sont réalisées dans leur lutte contre les forces de l'ordre. Sans trop tarder, je vais passer la parole au professeur Manar Abdrahim Slimi, qui fait partie, qui est un membre du bureau exécutif de l'Observatoire marocain contre la radicalisation. فليتفضل مشكورا.
مساء الخير. شكرا سي جلال، وشكرا للمرصد على الدعوة. مداخلتي هي عبارة عن محاولة لتشخيص التحولات التي قد تكون عرفتها التنظيمات الجهادية خلال هذه الفترة التي نعيش فترة الجائحة، وأنطلق فيها من فكرة، وهي أنه في كل مرحلة تحدث هناك تحولات في النظام الدولي فإنها تفرز تنظيمات إرهابية جديدة. هنا أتحدث مثلا، أقصد أنه كانت هناك تحولات في مرحلة معينة بعد الحرب الباردة أعطتنا القاعدة، وأيضا كانت هناك تحولات انطلقت تقريبا في سنة 2000 إلى سنة 2014 أعطتنا تنظيم داعش. اليوم هناك تحولات أيضا جوهرية في النظام الدولي، نحاول أن نشخص ماذا يجري على مستوى هيكلة وتنظيم وأشكال الفعل بالنسبة للتنظيمات الإرهابية، وأنطلق من فكرة أن النظام الدولي الحالي هو يعيش نوع من التوازن، ليس توازن القوى ولكن توازن الحذر والخوف. وأوظف هنا في فهم هذه التطورات نظرية الواقعية الجديدة. لماذا؟ لأنه لا أحد يعرف إلى أين يتجه النظام الدولي نتيجة الصراع الموجود على مستوى القيادة بين الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية والصين، ونتيجة صعود قوى تحاول، القوى الكبرى، أن تحجم دورها. وأتحدث هنا عن قوى إقليمية، أقصد مثلا إيران، تركيا إلى غير ذلك. داخل هذا التوصيف، ما هو الوضع التي تعيش التنظيمات الإرهابية؟ هناك الديناميات، ما يسمى بالديناميات الخمسة المرتبطة بالتنظيمات، والتي أشارت إليها العديد من التقارير إلى حدود سنة 2020. هذه الديناميات سأحاول أن أفحصها وأضيف إليها دينامية جديدة. أول دينامية أن الإرهاب خطر مستمر ولم يتوقف منذ 40 سنة، ومنذ 20 سنة على أحداث 11 سبتمبر، ومنذ 7 سنوات على نشأة داعش. إذن هناك مسارات يجب أن نستحضرها، يبدو فيها أن الحركات الجهادية لم تتوقف ولم تختفي، وأدبيات جهادية تحاول أن تفسر عوامل الدفع والجذب وتشرح الالتزام بالمسار الجهادي في مستوياته الميكرو فردية والماكرو مجتمعية. أيضا داخل هذه الدينامية الأولى أن الحركة الجهادية مستمرة في اللامركزية باختفاء الزعامات الكبرى، أتحدث عن بن لادن وعن البغدادي. ويبدو أن مساحات الخلافات الإيديولوجية بدأت تتقلص مع ملاحظة أن قضية التعاون مثلا بين خلايا القاعدة وخلايا داعش التي يحاول أن يلفيها البعض هي موجودة في بعض المناطق. مثلا في جنوب ليبيا هناك إشارات على أن هناك تعاون ما بين خلايا داعش وخلايا القاعدة، وإن كانت هذه المسألة لا زالت واضحة. أيضا يبدو بأن التنظيمات الجهادية هي تنزع نحو الإقليمية والمحلية. هذه النزعة الشيء الذي يدفع بعض التنظيمات إلى أسلوب ما يسميه البعض بالحروب بين مزدوجتين، الحروب التورية أو التمردية. لماذا؟ لأنها تأخذ هذا الطابع المحلي. أيضا النقاش حول الأولويات الاستراتيجية تضاءل. النقاش الذي كان موجود مثلا ما بين داخل القاعدة، مثال بين الظواهري والجولاني، أو حتى داخل تنظيم داعش. نقطة أخرى وهي المتغير الإسلامي والمتغير الجهادي. الكثير يتحدث عن المتغير الجهادي، ولكن لا ينسى بأن هناك متغير إسلامي، لأن بن لادن كان قبل موته قد بدأ عملية انفتاح للجهادية على الإخوان المسلمين. والسؤال هنا، بعد هذه الصراعات الموجودة للإخوان المسلمين في مجموعة من المناطق العربية بالخصوص مع الأنظمة السياسية، إلى أين تتجه؟ وهناك سؤال أيضا يطرح بعد فشل بعض التجارب الإسلامية بعد الربيع العربي، سؤال أيضا يطرح: كيف سيكون مصير هذه التنظيمات الإسلامية؟ أيضا هناك إضافة إلى هذه الديناميات التي اعتادت التقارير الاشتغال عليها، هناك دينامية جديدة، وهي التقارب الذي حدث بين إيران الثورة وبين التنظيمات السنية. نحلل كثيرا التنظيمات الجهادية السنية ولكن هناك شق غائب رغم حضور ضرباته، وهو التطرف الشيعي. هناك الكثير من التقارير تشير إلى أن هناك تعاون بين إيران وبين شباب المجاهدين في الصومال، بل أن هناك تعامل اقتصادي وهناك دعم وهناك تمويل لحركة الشباب من أجل ضرب العديد من المصالح الأمريكية. داخل هذه الديناميات أقدم ملاحظة حول ما جرى خلال فترة الجائحة. كان هناك رد فعل للجماعات الجهادية خلال فترة الجائحة. في البداية كان هناك سيطرة، وكان سيطرة نوع من الارتباك وظهور خطابات تحاول أن تفسر الجائحة بالعقاب الإلهي أو قرب القيامة أو دعوة المدنيين مثلا في الغرب في الدول الأوروبية إلى دخول الإسلام. هذه كلها خطابات أطلقت في البداية، ثم جاءت مرحلة أخرى في الجائحة وهي الدعوة إلى تجميد بعض الأنشطة، ولاحظنا بأن القاعدة وداعش هي توجه بعض التوجيهات لأنصارها من تنظيمات خاصة في أوروبا لكيفية التعامل مع الجائحة. ووقع تحول سريع بالدعوة داخل نفس الفترة من الجائحة بالدعوة لاستئناف العمليات والدعوة إلى استعمال الفيروس بنشره في الدول الغربية. هذه كانت الوضعية التنظيمات مع وجود بعض الضربات التي نعرف جميعا. ما هي النتائج من خلال هذا التشخيص التي يجب مراقبتها؟ أول نتيجة وهو سنكون أمام تنظيمات بخطاب إيديولوجي بعناصر جديدة. هذه العناصر هي مرتبطة بما راج خلال فترة الجائحة. خطاب المؤامرة الدولية، وجود مؤامرة في النظام الدولي، خطاب الدعاية بأن هناك أنظمة تتآمر على الشعوب، وخطاب بأن هناك دول ضعيفة وهي دول على وشك الإفلاس. مثلا كانت هناك بيانات من التنظيمات الموجودة في منطقة الساحل بأنها هناك دول مرشحة لأن تصبح دول فاشلة، وكانت التنظيمات تستعد لهذه العملية. أيضا لوحظ من المسائل التي يجب أن نراقب تقارب كبير بين التنظيمات الإرهابية ومنظمات الجريمة المنظمة، وأنها تستعمل نفس البروفايلات. وسأصل إلى مسألة البروفايل الذي يجب أن نراقبه لدى الإرهاب، البروفايل الذي قد يكون قد تكون. أيضا تقارب بين الإرهاب والشعبوية، يفهمان بعضهم البعض. أتحدث هنا عن التطورات التي جرت بينهم. أيضا هناك يجب مراقبة سيكولوجية أشخاص ظلوا محبوسين وتعاملوا مع كل الفضاءات الافتراضية وتدربوا على نمط جديد من التواصل. أيضا هذا الذي أصبح لدينا في نفس المعادلة الجهادية وحركات اليمين المتطرف واليسار المتطرف. بدأت تظهر بعض الحركات التي هي مرتبطة بالإرهاب، هي مرتبطة باليمين المتطرف. أيضا أن التنظيمات الإرهابية أصبحت على دراية بالفرص التي أوجدتها الجائحة. موضوع كورونا أصبح موضوعا للدعاية، ويبرر بالنسبة لهذه التنظيمات التطرف والإرهاب، بمعنى أنها تعرف الفرص. وهناك بعض المعلومات التي تقول بأن المستهدفين الذين قد يكونوا في مراحل لاحقة هم مثلا الأطر الطبية وأشخاص مرتبطين بقطاع الصحة، حسب بعض التوقعات التي لا زالت ليست قارة أو ليست مؤكدة. أيضا هناك إشارة على بداية مؤشرات تحول فعل إرهابي حدث وقع في ألمانيا، وإن كان لا زال علامة لا يمكن أن نبني عليه. هناك إشارات على إمكانية التحول إلى الإرهاب البيولوجي، مع ملاحظة أن التنظيمات كانت قد استعملت في مرحلة معينة مسألة الجمرة الخبيثة. هذا النوع الأول من النتائج التي يجب أن نراقب. النوع الثاني من النتائج وهو ما يسمى بدورة الإرهاب. هناك 5 دورات على الأقل الذين درسوا تاريخ الجماعات الإرهابية، وهنا كنتحدث على كل الجماعات، كنبدا من الحشاشين وصولا إلى داعش. فيبدو بأن كل العوامل اليوم هي تحضر أمامنا. هناك عوامل قد تقود إلى الإرهاب مرتبطة بمشكلة التمثيلية، ولاحظنا هذه المسألة في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية ودول أخرى. هناك دول تستعد لمسألة الحراك وقد تركب الجماعات الإرهابية على هذه المسألة. هناك فشل الأحزاب الإسلامية التي وصلت إلى الحكومة، كيف سيكون مصيرها؟ هناك عودة الدولة بقوة. هناك هذا الانتقال الذي نعيش اليوم في النظام الدولي ما بين الجمهوريين، أتحدث عن طرف، وما بين الديمقراطيين، بمعنى من لا نقاش على الحريات والحقوق إلى بداية نقاش على الحريات والحقوق. ثم هناك متغير آخر في العالم العربي، وهو هذه التوازنات التي حدثت مع إسرائيل. الكل يعرف بأن إسرائيل كانت تستعمل من طرف التنظيمات الإرهابية، فقد تعود التنظيمات الإرهابية وتستعمل هذه التوازنات الجديدة. النوع الثالث من النتائج وهو يهم منطقتنا التي هي منطقة شمال إفريقيا وتحت أقدامنا الساحل. توجد داعش والقاعدة في المنطقة. هناك موت لزعيم القاعدة في بلاد المغرب الإسلامي، عبد الملك دروكدال. عبد الملك دروكدال لم ينتبه الكثيرون بأنه انتقل من الشمال الشرقي في الجزائر إلى شمال مالي حوالي 2000 كيلومتر. لا أحد يعرف ماذا كان يفعل في شمال مالي قبل مقتله. معلومات تقول أنه كان بصدد عملية جمع تنظيم جديد. هناك صعود للعنابي، والعنابي هو مختلف عن دوركدال في عملية التوجه وإمكانية قيادة القاعدة. هناك تحول جبهة نصرة الإسلام والمسلمين، لم يعد لها ذلك الارتباط بالقاعدة. العملية الأخيرة التي كانت فيها فدية، الحصول على فدية من فرنسا، هي جعلت جبهة النصرة تأخذ مكانة أكثر من تنظيم القاعدة في بلاد المغرب الإسلامي. هناك تضاعف الضربات في منطقة الساحل مثلا، وأعطي مثال، هناك من يشير إلى أن الضربات تضاعفت ب7 مرات. أيضا ليبيا التي كانت هي مركز تدريب، والتي فيها تقريبا ارقام التي نعرف 20 مليون قطعه سلاح لا يعرف احدا اين ذهبت. فليبيا هي تحول جنوبها الى ما يمكن ان نسميها دوله اقامه للتنظيمات. اتحدث هنا عن جنوب ليبيا. ثم هذا الاحتكاك الذي حصل في ليبيا ما بين الجماعات الارهابيه والشركات العسكريه الخاصه، هذا ماذا يعطينا في هذه المنطقه التي هي منطقه الساحل؟ ولادة بروفايل جديد للإرهابيين، ليس البروفايل الذي نعرف. بروفايل فيه الإرهابي والمستخدم في الجهاد بين مزدوجتين، والمجرم المرتبط بمنظمات الجريمة الدولية، وبائع السلاح، والمتصارع مع منطقة ترابية، حول منطقة ترابية مثلا بعد الصراعات اللي كاينه في منطقة الساحل، وأيضا المتصارع حول الموارد، والمنتمي لإثنية، والعائد من سوريا والعراق. العائدون مدربون على حرب العصابات واستعمال التكنولوجيا، تدربوا في سوريا والعراق وتدربوا الآن في منطقة الصحراء الكبرى. هذا هو البروفايل الجديد الذي يجب أن يفكر فيه العقل الأمني. أنا أبتعد هنا عن التحليل السيكولوجي المتعارف عليه. لماذا؟ لأنه في نظري، في اعتقادي، أن هذا التحليل السيكولوجي لا يعطي نتائج اليوم. هناك بروفايل جديد وواضح، هذا البروفايل موجود ويمكن أن ندرس فقط جبهة نصرة الإسلام والمسلمين. أيضا هناك قضية الحدود. هناك خلايا محلية لما أغلقت الحدود تغيرت المعطيات. لم يعد مثلا الكثير من الأشخاص يذهبون إلى بؤر التوتر، وإنما باتوا يقومون بعملية استقطاب، وهي قد بدأت منذ سنة 2015. غنعطي مثال فقط. مثال في سنة 2015 فكك الأمن المغربي أفراد خلية ما سمي آنذاك بجنود الخلافة في المغرب لولاية العيون بين مزدوجتين. كانوا يريدون إدخال عائدين مقاتلين اكتسبوا خبرة في الميدان، عائدين من مناطق الصراع، أرادوا إدخالهم بطريقة سرية إلى المغرب. هذه كلها مخاطر جديدة، ولكن هي من منطلق التحولات الجارية في النظام الدولي. لأن التخوف الآن في عملية التحليل هو أن نحافظ على نفس الباراديغمات، على نفس التصورات للتحليل، على نفس البروفايل الإرهابي. مثال من الأخطاء التي تقال بأنه هناك نزوع نحو العالم الافتراضي. هناك في منطقتنا مثلا أتحدث هنا عن شمال إفريقيا وعن منطقة الساحل والصحراء، هناك إصرار من طرف التنظيمات الإرهابية على رقعة جغرافية، بل هناك من يقول بأنهم يفكرون في ميلاد دولة متنقلة في هذه بين دول الساحل الستة. إذا العديد من المعطيات يجب أن نعيد فيها النظر، ثم في اعتقادي أن المنطلق دائما يجب أن يكون من تحولات التي تجري في النظام الدولي والنزول آنذاك إلى ما يجري على المستوى المحلي. شكرا لكم.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur le professeur. Et il m'est impossible de résumer toute cette information riche concernant les métamorphoses que les mouvements djihadistes ont connues à partir de la période de la pandémie, mais seulement le fait de jeter la lumière sur ces transformations qui sont en relation avec la pandémie nous font découvrir une métamorphose de l'action djihadiste, du profil des réseaux et des politiques qui sont maintenant orientés vers des espaces territoriaux contigus, là où il y a beaucoup de choses qui se mélangent et beaucoup d'insécurité. Merci beaucoup pour tous les intervenants. Je remercie aussi l'auditoire qui a eu la patience d'attendre jusqu'à maintenant pour qu'on puisse finir cette séance. Et je lève la séance en vous remerciant et je vous donne un rendez-vous à demain matin pour la séance prochaine. Merci beaucoup. Merci à tout le monde. Merci, professeur.